In that case, we're going to have lots of time to talk. So let's move on to Shan Turnbull and his talk, which I'm going to have to pull up.
Oh, I could try screen sharing if you like.
Yeah, go ahead and do that, and then if that doesn't work, I'll well, it seems to work. Or is that me?
Oh, no, host disabled screen sharing, it says here.
Hold on a second. I've got to. Oh, this is always so infuriating. All right. Give me a second because this thing is not cooperating with me. All right. Screen share, where do, oh. I did this before. Where did I do it? Oh, there we go. Okay, try that now.
Is anything happening?
Yeah,
yes.
We've got your email, it looks like.
Oh, I don't want that. I'm going to stop. Get out of it. Try again. I don't want email. I was busy. See if I can find it on the screen once I get into. Oh, there we go. Try that.
That's it.
Is that it?
Yep.
I can't see it myself. I can't see it. Let me just see. I put it on. Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. Well, that's what it looks like today. So this is about avoiding extinction by adopting the governance architecture of nature. You see at the bottom here, I've got the link where anybody can access these PowerPoints. Now, Al Gore, a quarter of a century ago, said that economic policy should focus less on priming the pump and more on imprinting the DNA. But at the moment, we lack the vocabulary to even begin such discussions. 25 years later, some vocabulary is still neglected that can provide insights into natural systems. And these words are in my presentation. The words I'm using is holons, holarchy, and tensegrity. Is there a future for human social systems? The plague of people on the planet is degrading its air, water, soils, and biodiversity to place the future in question. To reliably and comprehensively expedite countermeasure to sustain humanity requires a system of global governance that can involve most of its 8 billion citizens to reliably simplify corrective action, including birth control without degenerate inbreeding as achieved by Indigenous Australians. Now, this is really the summary of the presentation that I'm going to end up with suggesting we use tax incentives to convert corporations into common good organizations. And so they can promote the common good locally and globally. But nearly all the dominant corporations in the world are command and control hierarchy, which deny a requisite variety of decision-making centers, communication channels, and control centers. Now, there is marvelous exceptions to this dominance. There are stakeholder-controlled corporations, and one such is the Visa Card organization, and the founding chief executive was D. Hock. And he gives and so Visa is an example of polycentric governance. It has hundreds of boards that operate independently for each bank that issues credit cards. And it's what Elinor Ostrom describes as polycentric governance. But Elinor Ostrom doesn't consider this concept of tensegrity, which I want to hone in on. She got the Nobel Prize for her analysis of economic governance and how you can avoid the tragedy of the commons, which arises from competing interests for life-sustaining resources. And this is a sample of her self-governance contributions. And self-governance is not taught at any university that I know of. But system science practitioners know how to design self-regulating and self-governing automobiles with the requisite variety of feedback data to survive dynamic, complex environments. But command and control hierarchies don't have that requisite variety. Ostrom proposed 10 design principles for creating polycentric governance, but they need to be reformatted because if you're going to apply them to corporations, you've got to take in the fact that the corporation is a separate entity from its stakeholders. She omitted the concept of tensegrity, which is ubiquitously present in nature, to create an ecological form of polycentric governance, and omitted a time limitation required in corporate forms to constrain their size, and we discussed that at an earlier session. Now, I've suggested reformatting her 8 principles into 9, and you can look at those 2 presentations I've made earlier this year on reshaping capitalism for a sustainable world and do we need a new model of corporate governance. D. Hock said that industrial age hierarchical command and control pyramids of power, whether political, social, educational, commercial, were aberrations of the industrial age, antithetical to the human spirit, destructive of the biosphere, and structurally contrary to the whole history and methods of biological evolution. They are not only archaic and increasingly irrelevant, they were a public menace. Now, that was over a quarter of a century ago. And the science of governance confirms Hock's views. Now, these 2 refereed journal articles identifies the science of governance and the science of corporate governance. They were based on my PhD thesis, which is presented in 3 forms, and it established the science of governance within or between any forms of life by introducing bites as the unit of analysis to ground social science in the natural sciences. The word tensegrity was created by Bucky Fuller from Tensional Integrity. He's holding a geodetic sphere here, and geodetic domes allow the greatest area to be covered with the least material. Tensegrity also allows DNA to minimize the materials to reproduce self-regulating, self-managing, self-governing life. Now, the beautiful thing about this, if instead of cables in between the struts, you had elastic bands, you could distort the sphere into all sorts of shapes, and it would immediately go back to its original form. So it's an innate object which has memory, which is, I think, very significant. Now, Harvard cell biologist Donald Ingber had an article in Scientific American, and he calls tensegrity the architecture of life. All bridge spans are normally, the main arch is supported either in compression or in tension. Now, here he's holding a little model of a tensegrity model, which if you changed it with rubber bands, and this is a child's toy, and this bridge in Brisbane combines tension and compression. So you can combining opposite characteristics from which emerge new features that didn't exist in the component parts. I mean, reinforced concrete is an example where steel is good in tension and the concrete is good in compression. And new emergent properties arise from combining these opposite characteristics. The law of requisite variety explains why DNA hardwires the tensegrity into living things. Ashby states that the gene pattern as a store of channel variety has limited capacity. Survival goes especially to those species that can use that capacity efficiently. And this is his chapter on amplifying regulation through supplementary co-regulators. And that's what we need to build into corporations to make them self-regulating. Now, this is a sort of a speculative question I ask for others to investigate. Is tensegrity in plant cells responsible for their functional architecture? In other words, might Tensegrity explain how tree cells use gravity to determine when to create branches so as to keep the structure in balance? Or explain how seeds determine what type of materials are used to create roots that grow downwards to obtain water and nutrients, while other types of materials are created that grow upwards to obtain energy and materials for growth. These are fundamental governance questions of nature that I suspect will be found in the, goes back to the tensegrity of the cells of the plants that have memory of where they want to be. Hierarchies are radically different from hierarchies. And a lot of people think, oh, it looks like the same sort of word, but it's not. D. Hock invented his own word. He didn't use the word tensegrity, and he wasn't aware of the literature. But he combined two words, chaos and order, which is a property of tensegrity. And he described holons in two different ways of self-organizing, self-governing, adaptive, nonlinear, complex organizations. So he's describing the properties of tensegrity. And this is the problem. Words are the tools of thinking, and different people use different words to refer to the same thought. So this is what Gore is talking about. We don't have the vocabulary to share, to all work together. Now, there's another word called holocracy, and there's a group of management consultants promoting this. And you may say, oh, that is a holarchy, or it's a hierarchy, or a heterarchy. Well, it's none of the above. It introduces decentralized decision-making within a firm in a similar way that the viable systems management both are subject to the grace and favor of management to deny contestability. Unless you get contestability, you can't get tensegrity. To introduce tensegrity, corporate constitutions need to be established to legally embed decision-making centers to create independence to establish contestability. So don't get confused by holocracy. If you want to know about holons, please go to my PhD supervisor, John Matthews, who explains them in a much more detailed and complicated way than I can remember or even teach, but I'm hoping that others will. He does not use the word tensegrity, but he explains holons in great detail, just as D. Hock does, without using the term. Just like Herbert Simon in his seminal essay on the architecture complexity was describing a holon, but in very awkward language. And this is why words are so important of sharing knowledge and getting us to understand system science. They are the tools of thinking. And I mean, in economics, for instance, the words are so ambiguous. I never try to use the word capital or value, because value is something that's undefinable, and capital is so ambiguous you never know what people are talking about. Dualities in nature generate tensegrity that is inhibited, denied, or punished in hierarchies. And this comes back to the yin-yang nature of nature. And individuals are holon, but we have this contrary behavior: approach, avoidance, cooperative, competitive, trusting, suspicion. You can go on and on. And organizations need to reflect sustainable organizations to sustain humanity on the planet. We need, which also have these tensegrity properties of being decentralized, centralized, autonomous, and integrated, bottom up, top down, ordered, and chaos. Light photons can be both waves and particles. There's no boundary. This explains my conversation with Thomas earlier about why have boundaries, because you have these opposite characteristics which create variety. You have the universe as a hierarchy of energy or matter, space-time, quantum, now, here, there, when. So it seems to be an isomorphic invariant of character of the universe. Now, this diagram I produced in the last century, and others have produced I've seen similar diagrams in earlier sessions with the same levels. What I've added for this presentation is sporting clubs, because it gets it down to at a level that individual lay people can understand, that you get your local sporting clubs, and those clubs compete with each other on the field, but they cooperate with each other to create state associations or regional associations that compete against each other, but cooperate to form national associations. National associations, in turn, compete against each other, but cooperate to form the international bodies, and the different types of sports can cooperate with each other to form the Olympic Committee. Note, there's no government involved. There's no command and control hierarchies, illustrating Ostrom's view that you can get self-organization, self-management, and self-governance without markets or hierarchy. Evolution cannot exist without the emergence of time at the beginning. For evolution to be maintained, new emerging entities or phenomena need to reproduce the dual paradoxical feature of tensegrity to generate a requisite variety of novel conditions to arise in different contexts for the process of evolution to continue. I believe that's a matter of fact and empirical evidence. My speculation is, if tensegrity is an invariant, does this mean that dark matter and energy can be explained as being the shadow of matter and energy collapsing back to the beginning to extinguish time? By a neurobiologist, Kelso and Ångström, wrote this book, and they recognized the complementary nature, the yin-yang nature on the cover of their book with its symbol. And they adopted the tilde notation to indicate these relationships in the brain. So I've adopted it also. They talk about the brain having bidirectional duality coupling, up, down, to create the tensegrity, and neurons that emergence and reduction. Both things are working together. Now, back to Al Gore and the role of government. I see it should be to enrich democracy, not to regulate firms, but to embed their DNA to adopt the self-regulating, self-governing practices of nature. However, most firms are centralized command and control. They are superb for introducing atrocities and dictatorships and armies. It allows power to corrupt absolutely firm directors, the business auditors, regulators, and society. Higher levels cannot exist without the lowers. But in ecological polycentric governance, stakeholders privatize regulation, so you don't need regulators, you don't need government. They have distributed control, checks and balances, universally found in living things, sustainable stakeholder firms, self-governing automobiles, Mars explorers, and indigenous societies. Lower levels can exist without higher levels. Now, here's some examples of large ecological polycentric governed firms: the John Lewis Partnership, the Mondragon Cooperatives, and Visa International, and Japanese Kritsusai. Now, all of these have existed for over half a century to show their resilience and competitiveness. The Mondragon Cooperatives create a whole nested network of polycentric republics because they had a rule of size. Once a firm got too big, it's split like an amoeba into different parts. And that's how Mondragon mainly grew at the beginning. The Japanese Kritsusai is an example because you get contestability between the customers and suppliers and the central producer organization. Ralph Nader introduced citizen utility boards to challenge the capture of regulators. We'll come back to that later. I've used the same idea of two public companies that I founded. I set up watchdog boards to watch me, because I knew it was more important that you kept your reputation than lost it, and it's best to have people truly independent to challenge you to keep you in order. I think that's why people get married, isn't it? So these are my examples of polycentric governance that I've been involved in creating. One was as the honorary chief executive of the non-incorporated Australian Ski Federation, and I wrote its constitution to federate its self-governing parts in each state. I did the same when I joined the single board in 1976 of the Company Directors Association of Australia, and the founder of that organisation had used it to promote his private business to sell life insurance and services to members of the non-profit company. So he had to retire, and to stop people using non-profit organisations for private purposes, I changed its constitution to make the national board subject to the forming self-governing state chapters who then control the national board. Now, Larry Fink, the chief executive of BlackRock, manages, I think, about $8 trillion of assets now. And in 2018, he said he wanted a new model of corporate governance so as to provide benefits for all stakeholders. Now, if corporations provide benefits for all stakeholders, they become a public good. It's a win-win for everybody. Now, what he wanted, I'd provided 16 years earlier in 2002, when the New Economics think tank was questioning the failure of privatisation under Thatcherism, and they realised they didn't want government ownership, and they didn't want private ownership, and what is the alternative? And the answer is stakeholder ownership. And in 2002, I was representing in Australia the largest institutional investor in England called the Hermes Focus Fund. And one of my colleagues there, about 6 years ago, came and now works for BlackRock and manages its stewardship program. Now, the problem, we need a new model of corporate governance because there's three sources of toxicity from command and control hierarchies. And one is, as I've mentioned before, if you have a single board, the directors have absolute power to identify and manage their own conflicts of interest, to corrupt absolutely themselves, the organization, the auditors and regulators in society. A simple command and control hierarchy can also unfairly exploit, demean, and abuse subordinates. The third problem of toxicity is that corporations have property rights in excess of investors' time horizon to overpay investors in a way not reported by accountants, and so not seen by economists or tax officials, to create inequality, inefficiency, and so bigger government taxes and government. Now, this is a very fundamental problem of economics, that we don't understand how a substantial way of inequality is created. Now, as they're not reported, you can't tax it. So what you need to do is share it, and that's what I'm suggesting, to introduce a tax incentives. But this is so now people say, oh, it can't possibly happen, but it's win-win for everybody. And politicians that want to get elected would get lots of votes for sharing the wealth of corporations to all their voters. Now, institutional investors with the fiduciary duty to maximize profits would be legally required to vote for such changes to provide investors with bigger, quicker profits with less risk, and in turn for giving away their equity to stakeholders. You say, oh, it's having limited life corporations impossible, and can't be done. But it removes the source of toxicity. So you need and you can do it by changing the tax incentives, change the constitutions of corporations. So instead of electing just one board of directors, they elect two boards, one to manage the corporation, the other to govern the corporate body, to remove the conflicts of interest. Also, for each stakeholder constituency obtaining voice, influence, resources to advise shareholders directly and their governors, independently of management, metrics of their individual well-being from corporate operations. And the Ralph Nader example of citizen utility boards gives the example of how they are done. And the third is to create in the Constitution a class of stakeholder shares that each year become endowed with a fixed percentage of shareholder equity, say 5%, the life of a patent. Shares can only be endowed to voting citizens, not to corporations, trusts, foreigners, or anybody else. It's the people in the community to localize ownership and control. Now, endowment corporations privatize the tax and welfare system to reduce the role and costs of intrusiveness of government. The tax incentives become self-funding, with their costs recovered from citizens paying tax at high rates and reducing government welfare costs. And the endowment corporations become a common good, providing benefits to all stakeholders locally and globally, and capitalism becomes sustainable, obtaining shareholder primacy, but this time for stakeholder owners. Now, another problem of hierarchies is they simplify complexity incompletely. This table assumes that from the workers up, 50% of the information is lost as it goes up each level of the hierarchy. It also assumes there's 50% error in the transmissions. They didn't know about Shannon's law. The end result is that decision makers, the board of directors, the missing and wrong information is 99%. And This is how you get absolute corruption. Shannon's law of communication states data transmission can be made as accurately as desired by introducing a requisite variety of independent cross-checking network channels as provided by ecological governance. Now, economic models used by scholars don't represent real people. This chart was done by a psychologist back in 1973. And it points out that people aren't always competitive. They're sometimes competitive, sometimes competitive, usually both. And that's showing tensegrity. And they stand in an interactive cybernetic relationship of their community and environment, and they are changed by the result of the interaction. And this is and models of governance of the leading scholars, Jensen and Mecking, they looked at 5 models of government. They're all static. It doesn't account that people change with context. And most scholars have made their reputations on these sort of models. Ralph Nader had the citizen utility boards. Customers volunteered $10 each to Ralph Nader so that they could get represented, and so it was done on a voluntary basis. And these boards still exist today because they add value for the stakeholders. Now, and this is talking about you need bottom-up contestability. So you want every big significant corporation to provide the resources to set up these polycentric governance of each of employee assemblies, supplier forums, customer councils, communities, advocates. And you'll notice here that the stakeholder congress, which represents competing interests, there's tension between these various stakeholders. They all have their own competing interests, but they notice that they provide the chair of the shareholders meeting. So stakeholders get a direct voice to shareholders of how they're being treated by management. So you get bottom-up contestability, voice and influence. The other change of the corporate constitution is the separation of power. So the shareholders general meeting elects 2 boards, one to manage, but it's done on cumulative voting, so you get minority voices represented, and you have a board of governors or guardians, and they're elected on an old-fashioned idea called 1 vote per investor. It's called democracy. So if you've got a major shareholder, the minor shareholders control the governance of the organization. They don't control the management, because that can still be 1 vote per share, but the checks and balances are introduced by the guardians, and it's the guardians who appoint the auditor, not the directors here to set and mark their own exam papers. So conflicts are avoided and simplified, and also directors' liabilities. Put them both together, and you end up with an ecological governance identified by Ostrom that can make corporations a common good benefiting everybody. And this would work for large publicly traded or private firms. Now, a lot of you would say it's impossible to have limited life, but this Grossman and Adams described how all corporations in the US were only chartered for limited lives because the state governments didn't want to be colonized by the English. And limited life creates creates creative destruction and a size limitation on corporations. Now, I've actually walked the talk on this, and I've funded 2 public companies with 15-year property rights. One was a vineyard company, which got founded in 1969, publicly traded in 1975. The other one was a cotton company I founded in 1979 and traded in 1984. And also I had a film underwriting companies. And in films, all the investors had limited life investments, but they still attracted investments because they got their profits quicker, sooner, with less risk. Back in 1974, the United Nations published an article suggesting this idea of that you could get more foreign investors, but they faded out with a profit. So this is the idea of transferring surplus profits to stakeholders to create less taxes, less size of government, to fund a universal well-being income. Now, the tax incentives are in my 1975 book, and the appendix has a trade-off. If you get different fade-out rates or endowment rates according to different tax deductions. And in India, they now require 2% of profits of all large firms to be given away to charity. So it's a similar idea, but instead of giving away cash, you give away power and control and property rights. This is my literature of selected journal articles on the same idea. You notice that some went to got into Czech because I was invited to go to Prague by the government to see if stakeholder governance would be a way of privatizing a communist state. I also got invited to Beijing to see of privatizing through stakeholder governance. Now the referee journal on it is my article on stakeholder governance, a cybernetic and property right analysis. It was published by my PhD examiner, Bob Tricker, and was put in the History of Management Thought. So there's a big literature. Now this shows you how a unitary board gets competitive advantages. Now Bob Tricker defines the functions of a board. It's external functions, it's conformance and performance, short-term and long-term. Now all this is done by a single board. Now what they do in Mondragon, they divide up each of these departments into different boards. So you get decomposition of decision-making labor. So you've got the watchdog board, the supervisory board, the work unit, and the social council, and the management board. So you've got 5 different boards. Ecological polycentric governance introduces decomposition of decision-making labor with distributed intelligence. So this is why it works. Now this is a single Anglican board, and the X is the amount of data. I'd like somebody to actually do empirical studies to analyze the amount of bytes transacted in the different boards. And here's the Mondragon compound board. It has 5 different boards. It has different amounts of individuals, and I think all these individuals include everybody in the business. You've distributed intelligence through the whole organization. And here's the activities of each of the board. So that's why polycentric government works, decomposes decision-making to simplify complexity. Now, toxic problems of hierarchies identified on the left-hand side. I won't go through them all. You can bring it. This is for detail. Mitigation by mimicking nature. And this is the problems of hierarchies on the left, and this is problems 1 to 5. You go on to the next problems, 6 to 11. Accounting doctrines hide investors get overpaid beyond their time horizon with surplus profits, creating hidden source of inequality and stakeholder exploitation. Ownership of surplus profit distributed by corporations issuing shares to citizens and stakeholders that democratize wealth and power, reduces the need for corporate taxes and welfare. That's problems 6 to 11 solved. The next problems are 12 to 16. Set of directors control reports about corporate impact. It's the stakeholders that report on how it's impacting. Set of directors marking their own exam papers. Stakeholders mark their exam papers. Directors are ignorant of shareholder identities because stock exchanges won't allow you to know who's trading your shares. These are in the sunlight. Share trading, price manipulation are hidden from directors and the public. No shares traded without prior disclosure. Shares traded covertly in dark pools. Corporations directly execute all share transfers. Problems 17 to 20. Directors are not held to account in hierarchies. They are in holarchies. So you can bring those up in discussions or move on. Awesome challenge for educators who have devoted their careers limited to researching and teaching toxic top-down management governance that alienates and demeans humans while suppressing human nature to deny them requisite variety of varying behavior to survive, thrive, and reproduce in complex, unpredictable, uncertain environments. As a result, most scholars and public cannot comprehend how survival of complex risks are best achieved without leaders, but a combination of top-down and highly democratic bottom-up initiatives. by the 8 billion people on our planet. Might you care to devote your life sustaining humanity by sharing the knowledge outlined? Join the Academy of Management online caucus, educating for managing existential risks for humanity, Monday, August the 10th this year. So hopefully you'd like to become more involved. Thank you.